It's not very often in the NBA that you have something that will never ever be replicated. There will never be a historical comparison to it, but that's exactly what the NBA bubble was 2 years ago. And considering that right around this time of the year 2 years ago, we were playing basketball in a bubble in front of no fans, I feel like now was a good time to look back on what a crazy experience that was. So I'm sure a lot of other people feel this way as well, but I can vividly remember where I was and what I was doing when the NBA shut down in the first place. It was in the middle of March. It was just a regular night for the NBA, and suddenly the season was suspended, and there was really no precedent for what was to come. March Madness was canceled. Basically, all sports shut down here in the US, and what that led to ultimately months later, I believe 4.5 months later, was an NBA bubble in Disney World. Now, there was a lot of ideas thrown around about what the NBA should do to create a safe environment if they were going to continue the season. But then once this concept of the bubble came about, it seemed really unlikely that it was actually going to work and that it was going to be something that was going to allow them to continue to finish out the season. But ultimately they landed on a bubble in Walt Disney World that was going to last up to 3 months for 20 teams in the league. They started with some play-in games and then the playoffs, and ultimately end with a regular finals just in front of no fans. And some players had more difficulty adjusting to the NBA bubble than others. On a bit of a lighthearted note here, Daniel House left the bubble because he tried to have a quote unauthorized guest in his hotel room, and he was not allowed to, and ultimately he left. Rashawn Holmes got suspended and had to be quarantined in the bubble as a result of him going to pick up a food order and stepping outside of the line of the bubble. And not to make fun of the situation, it was obviously a very serious thing around the world as well as, you know, here in the States and there for the NBA, but that's a pretty incredible headline now to look back on, and to show someone that headline like 20 years from now that a player had to quarantine and was not allowed to leave their hotel room because they got food picked up, like that's going to be pretty crazy to look back on. But now the basketball part of it, and we begin with the play-in games, because not only was this a new concept, but it is something that has continued on now and is going to become a permanent part of the league moving forward. This was a much larger and expanded version of the play-in tournament essentially, but they had, like I said, 20 teams show up because it wasn't as logistically feasible to have all 30 teams show up, and you played 8 qualifying games basically, then they had the play-in tournament, then they had the playoffs, and now the NBA has the top 10 seeds in the league basically make the playoffs 10, 9, and 7, and 8, play against each other in the play-in. That started in the bubble, but here's the craziest part of those qualifying games. Phoenix at this point was not very good. This is a team that would go on to make the finals and then win 60-something games this past season, and at the time they were still the 25-win Suns. They were still the Suns that they'd been for the last 7 or 8 years, and they go on an 8-0 run in the bubble. Like, Devin Booker is awesome. They have all these guys step up, and they still didn't make the playoffs, which begged the question, why were they invited to the bubble and to play in these qualifying games in the first place if winning every single one of them didn't ultimately qualify them for the playoffs? But this was actually a really important stretch for Phoenix, despite the fact that they didn't make the playoffs in the bubble, because that really legitimized what they were building. It was a big moment for that franchise, and then they go and trade for Chris Paul. They make the finals, and again, as I said, they won 60 plus games. And so I'm not trying to say that they wouldn't have gotten Chris Paul had they not gone to the bubble and gone 8-0, but if the season had just continued regularly and Phoenix had finished, tons of games out of the playoffs, maybe Chris Paul wouldn't have been as interested in joining them. And so that's a really critical point for them in Suns history. But then as we continue on through the playoffs of the bubble, we have to have the conversation that everybody has had since about what your accomplishments in the bubble truly meant. And there's two sides to this. One is it was more difficult to be successful in the bubble as a player. There were no fans. It was a difficult environment. A lot of players have come out and said that mentally it was a huge challenge for them to be isolated like that for 3 months, to be away from their families, to just have basically basketball in front of them for 3 months. For a lot of guys, they needed more of an escape that just wasn't there for them because they physically couldn't leave. And so for some people, that means whatever was accomplished in the bubble was actually even more impactful than what would have happened outside of it. Whereas for other people, not having the pressure of the fans, not having to travel, having only basketball be your focus actually kind of diminishes the accomplishments of the bubble. And specifically, it came down to the Miami Heat making the finals, and specifically Jimmy Butler having a great performance during the playoffs as well as in the finals. And then, of course, the Lakers ultimately winning the title. Now, since then, we've seen Miami continue to be good. They very easily could have been a finals team this past season, and Jimmy Butler was awesome at certain points for Miami in the playoffs. And so I think mostly that myth has been kind of written off, right? But then the Lakers part of it, a lot of people feel legitimized in their belief that that title was a quote-unquote Mickey Mouse title and that it shouldn't have counted wanted, and that the bubble was a huge advantage to LA. And at the time, immediately after the bubble, I was sitting there saying, well, like, yeah, it's a different circumstance, but everybody was in the same circumstance. Everybody was in the bubble. The mental challenges of the bubble were there for everybody. The physical challenges of not being able to leave, that was there for everybody. And ultimately, basketball was played, and the Lakers played the best basketball there, despite the fact that maybe some of their opponents in the postseason were injured. Of course, Goran Dragic was injured in the finals, and they, ultimately beat Miami in only 6 games. And so a lot of people say that maybe they didn't really earn that title. And at the time, I was saying, well, it was pretty well balanced, actually. However, since then, I've come to realize that not that it wasn't a legitimate title. Full credit to the Lakers. They played the best basketball there, and they should absolutely deserve a title for that. But the circumstances of that bubble situation were incredibly helpful for not only LA, but also for Miami as well. We'll start with Miami. Jimmy Butler is well known as a guy that he loves basketball, right? Like he loves working out, he loves working on his game, and he's very focused on that. And him, as well as I think that Heat roster as a whole, really thrived in that environment in the bubble, where all they had to do was focus on what was in front of them, and they were fine with the adversity that came with them. Whereas in contrast, a team like the Clippers, that's just not how they were built. They blew a 3-1 lead in the bubble. They, I thought, were the best team in the league going into the bubble. And so even though it was an even playing field, certain teams, Miami in this case, were more adept at playing in that more strenuous environment ultimately than a team like the Clippers was. And for the Lakers, it comes down to that 4.5-month layoff. I mean, you got to think this is still a 35-year-old LeBron James we're talking about here going into the bubble, and having that much time off for him and being able to just focus on the 3-month stretch and push towards the finals and towards winning a championship, that was kind of an ideal situation for that team to be in, because Anthony Davis had plenty of injury struggles. LeBron was getting older, and having a basically 2-month stretch for them they had to focus on, because they weren't really too worried about the qualifying games, really allowed them to just kind of play for the home stretch and just give it everything they have for 2 months. And that, I don't think, would have been as easy for them to do had they just come off of an 82-game season and then have to win, I should say, 16 games to win an NBA title. Not to say that the Lakers wouldn't have been contenders or won the title had we not gone to the bubble, but I think if there was a team that was successful in the bubble that benefited the most from the 4.5-month layoff, I think it was the Lakers. And there's some other interesting things about that Lakers team in the bubble as well, because going into the bubble, they were one of the best defensive teams in the league. And of course, they had LeBron and AD, who were incredible players, but they didn't have a ton of spacing, and that completely flipped in the bubble. It was very, very strange. I mean, really the only thing the Lakers were missing in terms of being championship contenders within, historically within the last 10 seasons of the league. Typically, teams are incredible three-point shooting teams. They're top 5, top 10, worst case percentage-wise in terms of three-point shooting. And the Lakers were like 22nd. Then they go to the bubble, they shoot the ball incredibly well, and that defense and their size really overwhelmed teams at times, and that really was what allowed them to win the title. And I'm not necessarily saying that having no fans and playing in the bubble meant that these guys were going to suddenly shoot the ball extremely well from 3. They certainly earned that. Maybe they worked on that. Maybe they had time over those 4.5 months to really improve that part of their game. And there have been plenty of teams throughout the history of the league that for a series or 2 series shot the ball incredibly well from 3, and that propelled them to more success than you would have expected in the postseason. But I do think that it's very interesting that this is a team that needed fresh legs and got them, and helped not only LeBron and AD, but also helped their 3-point shooting. Now, having said all those things, I'm still one of those people that says that it was a legitimate NBA title. I'm not taking away the LeBron title in the bubble. I'm not taking away KD's rings in Golden State. You play the best basketball, you win the title. That's how it works. I understand that KD going to Golden State wasn't fantastic for the league, and I understand that there are certain things that benefited the Lakers by being in the bubble, but everybody else was also in that situation, and they dealt with it better than anyone else. And where I finish when I think back and I look back on the bubble is, one, I'm glad it's over. I'm glad we got through that period of our lives, but also, how weird is it going to be to look? This is just 2 years later, and it already feels like such a strange event to look back on. Think about when it's 20 years ago and we're trying to, the bubble was 20 years back, and we're trying to explain to people what happened and why the league was suspended and what Rudy Gobert's role was in all this, and the fact that there were no fans and the Suns went 8-0 but didn't make the playoffs. We had qualifying games. It's going to be such a strange thing to try and explain to people. And that's ultimately where I land, is it almost feels like something that didn't happen. It almost feels fake, given not only the outcome of the bubble, but just the crazy circumstances in it. And full credit for the NBA to figuring out a way to make that work, to create that partnership between them and Disney and the Worldwide of Sports. I understand there's ESPN connections there, but like that was a very difficult thing to figure out how to do and make it work from a logistical standpoint, and it saved the end of that NBA season. If they couldn't do a bubble, that season basically was just going to be a lost season. They were just going to have to run it back the following year, and as we know, the schedule was messed up for a while after that, and just now is going to be going back to normal this upcoming season. But full credit to the NBA for making that work, and it's going to be a divisive and a polarizing topic, I think, for a long, long time in terms of what side you're on, what team you're on, in terms of team bubble wasn't that big of a deal to the players, or team like these accomplishments don't matter at all because of the crazy circumstances of the bubble. And I'm interested to see down in the comments which team you guys are on.